In this tutorial we're going to have a look at compression on bass guitar. Bass guitar is probably a really good example of why you need compression, because it needs to be really solid, because often it's the backbone of the track along with the drums. And it can also have a tendency to be quite inconsistent with a lot of variation in level. And you can see just by looking at this waveform here, there is quite a lot of variation in the dynamics. And while that can be a good thing, you need to make sure all the notes are heard so that the bass line can stay solid, and compression can help with that. So let's have a listen. So you can hear the variation in the levels there. Some notes are coming through more than others. So we'll start off just as we have throughout the chapter so far. Just start by pulling the threshold down until it starts to compress. And that straight away gives us a bit more headroom so we can turn up the gain. And that's already made a difference. The levels are already much more even, but we could try turning the ratio up a bit more. I think a lot of the time with bass you probably want some of the natural attack to come through, so you don't want the attack time to be too quick. If you do give it a quick attack time, then that will give you a little bit more headroom because it'll squash those transients at the start, but it will also make it sound more compressed. But as is always the case, a lot of this is subjective. You may actually like that compressed sound. I actually don't mind the bass sounding a bit compressed. I think it holds it together quite nicely, makes it sound more solid and quite punchy. But even still in this case, I think a bit of the natural attack still sounds better. But that does make it a bit more likely to clip, so we might want to use a limiter to deal with that. Give it a fast attack time to catch the peaks, and I also find it's an idea to pull the threshold down slightly under 0, just because if you leave it on 0, sometimes it still can clip. I think for this bass line we want the release to be a bit longer, because we do have some longer sustaining notes, and that just helps us to even out the level for a longer amount of time. If we bring the release down, that can actually create quite a nice effect. It brings out some of the personality of the room that the bass was recorded in, because as we've seen in other tutorials, a faster release time is basically bringing up the quieter part of the recording. So we're getting a bit of the natural reverb from the room that the bass amp was recorded in. But as we've also seen in other tutorials, the longer notes don't tend to sound so good with a shorter release time, so I'll turn it back up a bit. So I think this is pretty good. It evens out the level without making it sound too over compressed. But as always, check it in the mix and make sure that it fits with whatever you're mixing it with. In the case of bass that's been played with a pick, then the attack will be a lot sharper. And you can even see just by looking at the waveform that there's a lot of sharp peaks at the beginning of each note. So the sound of the pick actually adds a lot to the attack of the note. But aside from that, the levels aren't too bad. But there is quite a lot of variation in levels, so it could definitely do with some compression to make sure all the notes are heard. So the settings will probably be much the same as the last bass line. Just pull down the threshold till it starts compressing, then increase the gain. And you can see this meter here indicating that we're getting up to around 6 dB of reduction. And as the levels weren't too all over the place, that's done a pretty good job of evening it out, but we are still getting some overs here. So as I said, the sound of the pick has added a lot to the attack of each note, so we can control that by using the attack control. If you want them to come through, then just leave the attack a bit higher. Then we could use a limiter to deal with the peaks like we did before, or you could give it a faster attack time and then try and tame some of those peaks a bit. And that'll help with the clipping. It'll mean we don't need to use a limiter, and it will also give us a bit more headroom. And you can hear it hasn't actually taken it away too much. The brightness of the pick sound still comes through, but you really need to try it in the mix to see how well it still cuts through. Depending on what you're mixing it with, you might find when you bring the other instruments back in that it doesn't cut through so well anymore, and maybe gets lost in the mix, because those pick sounds can help it to cut through. So if you do find that happens, you could just try a higher attack time and then use a limiter to deal with the peaks. With slap bass, you might find that a compressor is a lot more necessary. You can see just by looking at the waveform here that there is a lot of difference between the highest and lowest points, with these really sharp peaks in the attack of the notes. And you'd probably find that with any slap bass, but in this case it's possible that it's more extreme because it was recorded with a DI bass, because there's no ample speakers to take away some of those higher frequencies, and a lot of these peaks will be in those higher frequencies. But whatever the reason, these peaks are quite extreme, so we do need to tame them if we want to get a bit more gain out of this. So you can hear a lot of the notes themselves are getting lost, and most of what we can hear is those percussive sort of sounds from the attack. So we'll start the same way, pull down the threshold, increase the gain, and you can see we're getting clipping already because of those peaks. So I think here we'll use the limiter to deal with that, so that we don't need to mess too much with the natural attack. And as before, just a fast attack and slightly under 0 for the threshold. And we can see this meter here indicating when it's limiting, so we can see it's actually coming on quite a bit every time one of those peaks hits basically. So it's already helped a lot, but I might try compressing it a bit more. Just increase the ratio, pull down the threshold a bit. Of course that gives us some more headroom to increase the gain. So that's definitely doing the job. You can hear a lot more of what's going on, not a lot of it's getting lost. In fact, we're starting to hear a lot more string noises now. So let's try it with a faster attack time so that we catch those peaks right at the start. We can hear straight away that that sounds a lot more compressed, but it also sounds a bit smoother because we're compressing it right from the start, so we're having a bit more control over it. And I don't think it sounds too bad having a very compressed sound here, but generally speaking I think slap bass is probably a bit better if you let the natural attack through a bit. And in fact I think with these settings here we're not doing too badly at the moment. This is sounding pretty good. We're hearing all the notes, everything's coming through, but it's also not sounding too compressed. But we could try and fine-tune the release time a bit so that it works a bit better with the timing of the bass line. And of course that brings out some of the later part of the sound. In fact that spot there is probably not too bad. It's quite a fast release time though, and it might not work so well with the longer notes, but it works quite well with the shorter, poppier slap bass playing. It brings it right out front, makes it sound quite punchy and in your face. And remember with a compressor that each of the settings affect all the other settings as well, so now that we've got a faster release time, we might want to try a faster attack time as well and see how that affects it. But of course, what really matters is how it sounds in the mix. We might get it sounding great here on its own, but then when you put it in with the mix, it doesn't sound so good, and vice versa. You get it sounding good in the mix, and then when you solo it, it doesn't sound so good on its own. So always keep that focus on how it sounds with everything else. Okay, well that's it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.